There are moments in life that stop time. Not the kind of time that moves on clocks or calendars. I'm talking about the kind of time that lives inside a man's chest. The kind that, when it stops, you feel it in your teeth, in your knees, in the space behind your eyes where grief has been living for weeks. I've been a retired civil engineer for 6 years. I've built bridges over rivers in 3 different states. I know how structures hold weight. But nothing I ever learned in 40 years of work prepared me for what happened on the morning of October 14th at Greater Emmanuel Baptist Church on Cascade Road in Atlanta, Georgia, when a woman I had never seen before sat down alone in the last pew of the church where we were burying my wife of 38 years. My name is Theodore Raymond Calloway. I am 64 years old. I was married to Dorothy May Calloway, born Dorothy May Simmons, for 38 years, 4 months, and 11 days. I know the exact number because I counted them the night after her funeral, sitting alone in our bedroom in the house we bought together in 1991 in the Cascade Heights neighborhood of Atlanta, holding the photograph we took on our wedding day at my mother-in-law's church in Savannah, Georgia. Dorothy was wearing white. She was 26 years old. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen in my life. And she was keeping a secret that would only reveal itself to me after she was gone. But to understand what happened that Tuesday morning in October, I need to take you back. Way back. Before the funeral, before the diagnosis, before the letter that Dorothy left behind in the drawer of her nightstand, the letter that my daughter Renee almost never found. And that changed everything I thought I knew about the woman I loved. Before we go there, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment right now. Have you ever loved someone completely, trusted them with your whole heart, and still found out there was a room inside them you never knew existed? Drop it below. Subscribe if you believe that love can survive even the secrets it was never told. Because this story is about exactly that. Let's go back, 35 years back, to a version of Atlanta that most people no longer remember. The year was 1989. Dorothy and I had been married for 2 years. We were renting a small apartment on Benjamin and Mays Drive, not far from Morehouse College, where I had graduated 5 years earlier with a degree in civil engineering. Dorothy was working as an administrative coordinator at Grady Memorial Hospital. We were young. We were building something, and we were deeply in love in the way that only people in their late 20s can be, with everything forward, everything possible, everything untested. Those were full years. We attended First Calvary Baptist every Sunday without exception. Dorothy sang in the choir, second soprano, standing in the 3rd row on the right side, always wearing the same cream-colored robe with the gold trim that she pressed herself every Saturday night. I served on the deacon board alongside men I still call brothers today, Reverend Antoine Grayson, who still leads the congregation, and my closest friend of 41 years, Harold Eugene Patterson, who flew in from Charlotte specifically to sit beside me at her funeral. Those were the years when Atlanta's black middle class was growing in ways the rest of the country hadn't yet noticed. And Dorothy and I were part of that growth. Careful, intentional, proud. She was a planner. That was Dorothy. Where I built structures out of concrete and steel, she built structures out of time, schedules, traditions, rituals. Every Thanksgiving, the dining room table held no fewer than 18 people. Every Christmas Eve, we drove to Savannah to spend 3 days with her mother, Miss Eloise Simmons, a woman who made the finest sweet potato pie in Chatham County and who never once raised her voice in anger in all the years I knew her. Dorothy had that same quality, a stillness, a capacity to hold difficult things without breaking under their weight. I admired it. I marveled at it. I never once questioned it. That was the first thing I missed. Looking back now, I can see it clearly. The stillness was not only grace. Sometimes it was a door, closed quietly, with something heavy locked inside. In the spring of 1989, 6 months before our second anniversary, Dorothy went to Savannah for what she told me was a long weekend with her mother. I remember the morning she left, a Friday in April. The dogwoods were blooming along the side streets off Cascade Road, and she kissed me twice at the door of the apartment and told me she would call when she arrived. She did call, and she came back on Monday, as planned. She was quieter than usual for a few days after, but Dorothy was sometimes quiet after long visits with her mother, who was aging and whose health required more attention each year. I assumed that was the reason. I handed her a cup of tea, I rubbed her shoulders, and I never asked what was really wrong. I didn't know. How could I have known? I was 28 years old and completely in love with a woman I believed I understood entirely. The idea that Dorothy was carrying something that April, something she would carry for the next 35 years, through 2 children, 3 houses, 1 grandchild, and a cancer diagnosis that came on a Wednesday afternoon in March of last year, never entered my mind. Not then. Dorothy was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer on March 7th of last year. I was with her at Emory University Hospital when Dr. Patricia Ussin-Mensah sat across from us in her office on the 4th floor and explained what the scans had found. I held Dorothy's hand through the entire conversation. I remember the way the afternoon light came through the blinds in that office and fell across the desk in pale yellow lines. I remember thinking in some distant corner of my mind that was still trying to function rationally, that those lines on the desk looked like the structural diagrams I used to draw. Something in me was already trying to engineer a solution to a problem that had no engineering solution. We did not panic. That was not our way. We drove home. We sat together at the kitchen table. Dorothy made chamomile tea, and we talked about the road ahead with the same calm deliberateness with which we had approached every significant moment in our lives. She started chemotherapy at Winship Cancer Institute 3 weeks later. For 8 months, I drove her to every appointment. I sat in every waiting room. I learned the names of every nurse on her floor. Tamara, Deshaun, Kaisha, a young man from Nigeria named Emeka, who always greeted Dorothy with a slight bow that she said made her feel like royalty. I watched my wife fight with everything she had. She fought beautifully, but the cancer was ahead of her, and by November, Dr. Ussin-Mensah sat us down again and told us that the treatment had stopped working. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. Our daughter Renee, 34 years old, a litigation attorney at a firm on Peachtree Street, moved into the guest room to help. Our son Deshaun flew in from Houston, where he works as a project manager for a construction company, and stayed for 10 days before his own family obligations called him back. Dorothy's sister Paulette came up from Savannah. The house was full of people who loved her, and Dorothy, true to herself until the very end, was the one who made sure everyone felt taken care of. It was during those final weeks that she began writing. I noticed the yellow legal pad on her nightstand sometime in late November. She had always preferred legal pads to journals, said the lines felt less confining. I didn't ask what she was writing. I gave her that privacy without being asked for it, because that is what 38 years of marriage teaches you. You learn the difference between secrets and sanctuary. I thought she was writing letters to the grandchildren, to Renee and Deshaun, maybe to me. I was not entirely wrong. Dorothy Mae Calloway passed away at 6:17 in the morning on October 9th, at home in our bedroom, with Renee holding her left hand and me holding her right. The morning light was just beginning. The room was quiet. I had been awake since 3 o'clock, sitting beside her, listening to her breathe. When she stopped, the room didn't feel empty. It felt held, like the walls themselves had gathered around us to bear witness. The funeral was 5 days later, on October 14th. I want to tell you what that week was like, because you need to understand the state I was in when I walked into Greater Emmanuel Baptist Church that Tuesday morning. I had not slept more than 4 hours on any given night since Dorothy died. I had eaten primarily because Renee put food in front of me and watched until I picked up the fork. Harold had been calling every morning at 7 o'clock, as he had promised, and those calls were the rope I held onto in a current I had not anticipated. I am a man of faith and structure. I had walked through difficult seasons before, but grief at 64, after 38 years of building a life alongside someone, is not a season. It is a landscape. You don't walk through it. You learn to live inside it. The service was at 11 in the morning. By 10:40, the church was filled to capacity. Dorothy had touched more lives than I had fully comprehended while she was living them. Former colleagues from Grady, members of her Delta Sigma Theta chapter from Spelman College, neighbors from every house we had ever lived in, the women from her Thursday Bible study, the children she had mentored through the church's youth literacy program for the past 15 years. The choir wore white. Reverend Grayson had prepared a eulogy that I knew, even before he delivered it, would say everything true about her. I was seated in the front row with Renee on my left and Deshawn on my right. Deshawn's wife, Camille, sat beside him. Paulette was next to Renee. We were a row of people holding ourselves upright by holding on to each other. It was Renee who saw her first. I noticed only because Renee touched my arm, a specific touch, not the gentle pressure of comfort she had been offering all week, but something firmer, something alarmed. I turned to follow her gaze toward the back of the church, and that is when I saw her. A woman, seated alone in the last pew on the left side of the sanctuary. She was dressed entirely in black, a black dress, a black hat with a short veil, black gloves folded in her lap. She was seated away from everyone else, with an empty pew space on either side of her, as if she had deliberately left distance between herself and the rest of the congregation. She was looking forward, toward the altar, with the stillness of someone who is working very hard not to show how much effort that stillness is costing her. She was, I would later learn, 35 years old. She had driven 7 hours from Memphis, Tennessee, alone in a 2019 Honda Accord that needed new brakes. She had arrived in Atlanta the night before and spent the night in a Hampton Inn on Peachtree Industrial. She had not slept, but I did not know any of that yet. What I knew, in that moment, was that I had never seen this woman in my life. And something about the way she was sitting, the careful distance, the rigid composure, the gloved hands folded too precisely, lodged itself somewhere in my chest before I could name the reason. Renee leaned close to my ear. "Daddy, I don't know who that is." "Do you know who that is?" I shook my head. "I'm going to go ask her to leave," Renee whispered. Her voice had the low, controlled edge that I recognized from watching her in depositions. "This is a private service. She's not on the family list." I put my hand on her arm. "Wait until after," I said quietly. But Renee did not wait. I should have known she wouldn't. She has her mother's stillness without her mother's patience. She stood up during the processional music, walked back through the center aisle with the careful, deliberate stride of a woman who will not cause a scene but will absolutely address a situation, and sat down in the pew directly in front of the woman in black. I watched from the front row, across the length of the church, as Renee leaned toward the woman and said something. I could not hear the words. The choir was singing, "It is well with my soul," and the sound filled the sanctuary from floor to ceiling. What I saw next is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The woman in black turned toward Renee, and then she turned toward me, across 30 feet of church aisle, across the heads of nearly 200 people, across 35 years of a secret neither she nor I knew we shared, and she looked at me directly. Renee said something else. I could see from Renee's posture that she was asking the woman to leave. The woman shook her head once. And then, I don't know what was said. I don't know what words passed between them in those seconds. The woman's composure broke, just slightly. Just enough. And she said something that made Renee go completely still. Renee turned and looked at me from across the church. Her face had changed. Something in it had opened, not in anger, not in confusion, but in a kind of stunned, searching recognition that I had never seen on my daughter's face before. She raised her voice just enough for me to hear it over the choir. Daddy. Just that. Just my name. The way she has said it since she was 4 years old, but weighted now with something I could not yet interpret. I stood up. The service paused. Reverend Grayson saw me rise, saw something in my face that told him to hold, and I walked back through the center aisle toward the last pew. The congregation was quiet in the way that large gatherings go quiet when something real is happening and everyone can sense it. I walked past Harold, who looked at me with concern. Past Dorothy's sister Paulette, whose hand went to her mouth as I passed. Past the women from the Thursday Bible study. Past the Morehouse alumni who had come to honor a woman who had spent her life honoring her community. I reached the last pew. The woman in black looked up at me. Up close, I could see what I had not been able to see from the front row. I could see the shape of her face, the structure of her cheekbones, the particular angle of her jaw, the way her eyes, dark brown, wide-set, careful, were arranged in a face that was, in some architectural way I felt before I understood it, deeply familiar. She looked like Dorothy. Not the way a resemblance makes you do a double take on the street. Not a vague similarity. She looked like Dorothy at 26 years old, in the photograph from our wedding day, in the cream-colored dress, before I ever put a ring on her finger. My hand found the back of the pew. I needed something solid. The woman stood. She was trembling slightly. Her gloved hands, which had been folded so carefully in her lap, were now pressed together in a gesture that was almost prayer. She looked at me with the eyes of someone who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and is not sure whether she is about to be relieved of it or crushed by it entirely. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was low, Memphis in it, a slight southern cadence, not Atlanta, not Savannah, something further west. "I almost didn't come. I almost turned around 3 times on I-20. But she said, your wife said in her letter that you were a man who could hold difficult things. She said you were the strongest person she had ever known." She paused. Her voice was breaking, but she was managing it. She said if I was ever going to know the truth, it had to be today. Here. She arranged it herself. I could not speak. I stood there with my hand on the pew and looked at this woman who had Dorothy's face and Dorothy's stillness and 35 years of unanswered questions in her eyes. "She wrote to me 4 months ago," the woman continued. "My name is Vivian. Vivian Grace Calloway. My birth name, the one given to me at the hospital, was Grace." She stopped. She straightened her spine in a way that reminded me, with an almost unbearable force, of the way Dorothy used to gather herself before saying something that cost her something. "She said you're my father, that she had me in April of 1989 in Savannah before you knew, that she gave me up because she was afraid of what it meant, afraid of hurting you, afraid of losing everything she was building with you, and that she spent 35 years being wrong about that decision." Renee was beside me. I don't know when she had moved to stand at my shoulder, but she was there. I could feel her presence, the way you feel the presence of someone you have known since the first breath of life. I looked at this woman, Vivian Grace. "Dad," she whispered, and the word landed in my chest like the last piece of a structure finally clicking into place, the load-bearing element that explains why everything else was built the way it was built. What I know now that I did not know for 35 years, I learned in pieces over the days and weeks that followed that funeral. Dorothy had become pregnant in the summer of 1988, not by infidelity, not by anything that diminished the love between us, but in the weeks before our marriage, during a time of confusion and distance that we had both contributed to and that had resolved, as these things sometimes do in young love, without full accounting. She had not known she was pregnant when we married in June of 1988. She discovered it in October of that year. She panicked in the way that a 26-year-old woman can panic when she does not yet have the language for her own fear. Fear of what it would mean for our new marriage. Fear of her own feelings about the circumstances. Fear of a conversation she did not know how to begin. She went to Savannah in April of 1989, ostensibly to visit her mother. What she actually did was deliver the baby she had concealed through a combination of careful clothing, long shifts at Grady, and the kind of self-control that I had always admired in her without understanding its full depth. Her mother, Miss Eloise Simmons, a woman I knew for 20 more years after that, and who looked me in the eye at every Thanksgiving and every Christmas Eve, had helped her arrange the private adoption. The baby girl, born on April 14, 1989, weighing 6 pounds and 3 ounces, was placed with a family in Memphis, Tennessee, within weeks of her birth. Her name on the original paperwork was listed as Grace Simmons. The family in Memphis were good people. I know this because Vivian told me so, with the directness and fairness of someone who has spent years processing a complicated history without bitterness. Her adoptive parents, Kenneth and Sandra Whitfield, were both educators, he a high school principal, she a middle school science teacher. They told Vivian she was adopted when she was 7 years old, which the research consistently shows is the right time to have that conversation. She had a good childhood. She had a younger brother, also adopted, named Marcus. She graduated from the University of Memphis with a degree in social work. She now runs a nonprofit organization that provides counseling and support services to families in the foster care system in Shelby County. She has never been married. She does not yet have children of her own. She had spent the last 6 years, with the help of an adoption search service, trying to locate her biological mother. She had found a trail that led, eventually, to Atlanta, to a woman named Dorothy Mae Calloway, née Simmons, of Cascade Heights. She had written Dorothy a careful, measured letter in late May of last year, not long after the cancer diagnosis. Dorothy had written back in June. They had exchanged 7 letters over the following 4 months, handwritten letters, because Dorothy said it mattered how a thing was put down. I found them after the funeral in the same drawer as the letter Dorothy had written to me, tucked inside a manila envelope labeled in Dorothy's handwriting, for when it's time. I want to be honest about what I felt when I first read those letters. There was grief, of course, a new, layered grief, because reading them was like hearing Dorothy speak from a room I had never been allowed to enter, and the voice was so completely hers that it was both a gift and a wound. But I did not feel betrayed. I want to say that clearly because I know that is what people expect a man to feel in this situation. I am 64 years old. I have been married. I have raised children. I have buried a parent. I have watched friends go through the full range of what life requires of human beings. I know that people carry impossible things for reasons that are rooted not in malice, but in fear. Dorothy was afraid. She had been afraid for 35 years. And in the final months of her life, she had found a way to stop being afraid. That took courage. More courage, I told Renee later that week, than I might have shown in the same situation. The letter Dorothy had written to me was 3 pages long on her yellow legal pad in the handwriting I had read for 38 years. She told me everything. The pregnancy, the fear, the decision, the decades of silence, and the weight of that silence. She told me she had loved me every day of those 38 years with everything she had. She told me that the decision she had made in 1989 was the greatest regret of her life, not because it had destroyed anything, but because it had prevented something. It had prevented Vivian from knowing her father. It had prevented me from knowing my daughter. I am asking you, she wrote, to receive her. Not for me, not to forgive me, though I hope in time you will. But for her, because she is yours, Theodore. She has your patience and your precision and the way you look at a problem from 3 different angles before you speak. She has your hands, long fingers, careful. She is a good woman. I made sure of that. I watched from a distance for years and then up close in these last months, and she is a good woman. She will be at the church. She will be the woman alone in the back, in black. Please don't make her leave. Those days after the funeral were not simple. I want to be honest about that too, because this story is not a neat one, and you deserve the full truth of it. Renee needed time. That is the only way I know how to say it. She loved her mother with the totality of a firstborn daughter, and the discovery that Dorothy had carried this secret had looked Renee in the eyes for 34 years without telling her she had an older sister, shook something foundational in her. We had long conversations. Renee cried in ways I had not seen her cry since she was a child. We sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning on more than one night, working through it the way our family has always worked through things, with honesty, with patience, with the willingness to sit inside the uncomfortable question rather than reach for easy answers. Deshawn, characteristically, processed it quietly and then called me from Houston 3 days after the funeral and said, "Dad, she's family." What do we do? That is my son. No drama. Just the next right step. I called Vivian at the number she had written on a card she pressed into my hand outside the church in the parking lot after the service. She had stood there with her car keys, uncertain whether to leave or stay, and I had told her to wait. We had sat together on a bench near the entrance of the church, me in my funeral suit, her in her black dress, the October sun at a low angle that threw long shadows across the pavement, and talked for 45 minutes. I asked her about her life. She told me. I told her about mine. We were careful with each other in the way of people who were trying to build something new in a space that is also filled with loss. I told her that Dorothy had been right about one thing. She did have my hands. She looked down at her hands in her lap, those long-fingered hands in the black glove she had removed, and she laughed. It was the first time I heard her laugh. It sounded like Dorothy at 26, and like something entirely her own, and I had to look away for a moment to collect myself. Over the weeks that followed, Vivian and I spoke by phone twice a week. She sent me photographs of her childhood, a serious little girl with pigtails in a yellow dress at a birthday party in Memphis, a teenager in a cap and gown, a young woman in a social work graduation photo. I sent her photographs of Dorothy. She received them with a reverence that I recognized as grief for someone she had only known through letters, and I understood that her mourning was real, even though her loss was different from mine. In November, 6 weeks after the funeral, Renee called me from her office on Peachtree Street. Her voice had something different in it, still careful, still measured, but warmer. She said, "I've been thinking about Thanksgiving, Daddy. Deshawn and Camille are coming. Paulette is coming." There was a pause. "I think we should invite Vivian." I held the phone for a moment before I answered. "Your mother would say that was exactly right," I told her. Renee said, "I know she would." Vivian drove up from Memphis the day before Thanksgiving. She pulled into the driveway of the house on Cascade Road at 4:30 in the afternoon in her 2019 Honda Accord. The brakes had been fixed, she told me, at a shop in Memphis the week before, and I walked out to meet her. She stepped out of the car with a dish covered in foil. She had made her grandmother's sweet potato pie, her adoptive grandmother's recipe, she said quickly, as if the clarification were important. I told her that Dorothy's mother had also made sweet potato pie that was the finest in Chatham County. Vivian said, "Maybe it runs in the blood." We stood there in the driveway for a moment, my daughter and I, meeting for real this time, without the weight of a funeral surrounding us, and the late November light fell across the yard in long gold lines that reminded me of something, though I couldn't immediately say what. Then I remembered. The afternoon light in Dr. Assemen's office the day we received Dorothy's diagnosis. Those lines on the desk that looked like structural diagrams. I had been trying to engineer a solution to an unsolvable problem. What I had not yet understood on that March afternoon in the hospital was that Dorothy had already been working on the solution. She had been working on it for months. She had found it in a careful, handwritten exchange with a daughter she had never stopped loving, and she had arranged with the patience and precision that defined every year of her life for the truth to come home. She did not live to see it arrive, but she built the bridge. She always knew how to build things that would last. I held the front door open for Vivian. The smell of Renee's cooking, collard greens, cornbread, turkey with the rosemary rub that had been our family's tradition for 2 decades, came through the door and settled around us both. "Welcome home," I said. She walked in. It has been 4 months since that Thanksgiving. I am still learning who my daughter is. She is 35 years old, and there are 35 years I did not witness, and some of that time will always be a distance I cannot close. I have accepted that. Renee and Vivian have spoken 4 times on the phone, and last month, Renee drove to Memphis for a weekend. She said she came home with the same careful, evaluated expression she gets after a complex case. She also came home with Vivian's sweet potato pie recipe. She said, "She's a good person, Daddy." She said it the way Dorothy would have said it. Deshawn and Camille have made plans to meet Vivian in the spring. What I know now that I did not know a year ago is that love is not only what you say. It is also what you build in silence, in the places where language fails you, in the decisions you make in fear that you spend the rest of your life hoping were not permanent. Dorothy was afraid. She made a decision she carried for 35 years. She made it right the only way she could, with the time she had left and the courage she had finally gathered. That is the full truth of her. Not the secret, not the silence, the courage. The courage she summoned in the last months of her life to tell the truth and let the people she loved hold it. Hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. But I've come to believe that hindsight is not only about what you wish had been different. Sometimes it's about seeing clearly and finally the whole shape of a love you were living inside of, and understanding that its complexity was part of its integrity. Dorothy was not perfect. Neither am I. Neither is any marriage, any family, any structure built by imperfect human hands. But what she left behind, the letters, the arrangement, the careful decision to tell the truth before she left, that was the truest version of herself. And I am grateful for it. I kept the letter she wrote to me. It sits now in the drawer of my knitstand, in the same place where the yellow legal pad used to be. I read it sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the grief has settled into the particular frequency that grief takes on. After the first raw months, still present, still real, but something I can breathe around. Some nights I read the last line of it more than once. She is yours, Theodore. She has your hands. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever loved someone and discovered that love is larger than what you knew, or carried something alone that deserved to be shared, please share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe if you believe that truth, even when it comes late, is still worth the arriving. And leave me a comment. What would you do if you discovered a secret like this about someone you loved? I read every single one. Thank you for sitting with me through this. From the bottom of my heart, thank you.